SSP Wednesday seminar. Taylor Fable, Director of SSP, and really delighted to welcome Mike O'Hanlon to be our speaker today. He's a Senior Fellow and Director of Research in the Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institution, where he specializes in U.S. defense strategy and budgets, the use of military force, and American national security policy. He directs the Strobe Talbot Center on Security Strategy and Technology, and is the inaugural holder of the Philip H. Knight Chair in Defense and Strategy. And yes, that is Nike's Phil Knight. So, who is, I think, a big supporter of Brookings. It would take me probably another 5 minutes to review everything that he's written and read. I think Mike is well known to many of us. He's going to speak to us today about a new book that he's sort of in the final lap of finishing, To Dare Mighty Things, U.S. Defense Strategy since the Revolution. I'm just tempted to ask, which revolution?
Anyway. But we're in Boston, so you guys.
Anyway, welcome.
Thank you. It's nice to be
Pleasure
here.
to have you here.
Thank you so much. What a treat to be at this place. Just really the gold standard by far in the United States for security studies, in my opinion, even though I didn't go here and don't teach here. but I'm also lucky in one sense that I got to go to Princeton at the time Barry Posen was teaching there. So if my talk is incoherent and my career has been a mess, you can blame him. But as well as Kenoi, who also was at Princeton at the time. And so it's such a treat to come back and see people who have been my role models and teachers and my friends for so long. Let me, in that same spirit, continue on with just a couple words on how I chose to address this topic in this book. And I was always struck, and Barry was one of the people who conveyed this to me, and Steve Biddle and Ken Pollack and a few others. There were certain people who just seemed to know history from the day I met them anyway, if not the day they got to college or something. And I was not one of those people. And I certainly didn't know much military history. And so I was struck going through my career, especially as I got to know some of our famous generals and whatnot, how they knew history better than I did, and how I had never really properly learned it. When Steve Walt was on my dissertation committee and he said that I had passed my oral exam, he said, keep reading history. And I remembered that, but I had never tried to do a book on history myself. And I was always struck that there wasn't, at least there were some surveys, obviously, of military history, but there wasn't a book, at least that I knew of, that tried to address most of American military history at the level of strategy and campaigns. There are a lot of books that are detailed on individual conflicts or war heroes or maybe even periods in history, but I wanted to focus on strategy and campaigning. And that was my previous book. And so I had sort of looked at all of America's major wars, and then I thought, well, why not try to connect the periods of wartime with the periods of relative peace and see if I could do something that made sense across 250 years and see if there were any big themes that popped out. So that was the motivation to do the book. I just feel like the field of study doesn't pay enough attention to military history, or maybe more to the point, I hadn't paid enough attention to it. And maybe this was my effort at my own remedial education at the tender age of 60 something, as well as trying to offer something to the field that I hope will, contribute to the literature. So that's where I'm coming from in the book. And I'm not really coming at it, I'm neither an historian nor a true political scientist. I'm a security studies guy. I'm a defense analyst, if I want to define myself as how I see myself. So in that sense, I'm straddling two disciplines. And Caitlin always told me to make sure I wrote a chapter 8 that looked for lessons and looked for connective tissue. So I will try to talk a little bit about that today. But what I really wanted to do in the book originally was just understand the history through the 250 years better than I had before. So that's where I came from in attempting this project, and hoping that the previous book on major wars in our history would help me have a head start on the entirety of the history. A word on definitions, and I know that, again, Barry and Josh Rovner, who's giving a talk at Brookings on Friday and just wrote a book on grand strategy, and others have contributed to our understanding of these different terms in the field. Let me try to be clear. This is a book about defense strategy or military strategy. And I'm thinking of that as one level down from grand strategy. So if grand strategy is the big theory of the case for how a country tries to be secure and also promote its power, then defense strategy, by my definition at least, was sort of everything below that. What forces do you acquire, sustain, What budgets do you pass and appropriate? What modernization agendas do you pursue? Where do you posture and deploy your forces? How do you operate with them in peacetime, in crisis, and in war? So that's the full 9 yards of how I think about defense or military strategy. I use the terms interchangeably. You know, if you go to today's Pentagon, they have one explicit definition for a national defense strategy and another for a national military strategy. And I'm not using the words in that kind of confusing inside baseball fashion. To me, I'm using defense and military strategy interchangeably. Although one point I make early in the book, and let me now get into the substance, is to say that I don't think the United States usually has defense strategies. We usually have either in our early days offense strategies or global strategies, but we don't really have defense strategies. This is sort of belaboring the obvious for a country that, you know, stretches from sea to shining sea in North America and has a very favorable geographic location in terms of defense. But what I was struck by as I started to do the history, and here I'm a student of Bob Kagan as much as anybody on this issue, is that the United States was an extraordinarily ambitious country from the get-go. And the idea that we were ever sort of passive or isolationist or minimalist in our way of thinking about the world doesn't compute to me. I think we've been an extremely ambitious and assertive people from the get-go. And we now think of this whole wonderful country stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific as ours, but it didn't start that way. And so, in fact, our first half of our military history was about acquisition. It was about expansion. And I'll look forward to the discussion and whether people agree with me on this point. But I think that for me to use the term grand strategy in reference to the United States, you have to think about more than just defense. This is not just a theory of the case for how to make ourselves safe. We have always been a lot more ambitious than just wanting to be safe. We wanted to be big, we wanted to be powerful, and we wanted to be influential. And since the 1940s, we've wanted to set the rules of the road for the global commons, to quote Barry again, and for the world writ large. And so to me, this is not defense strategy. This is a grand strategy for the United States has been about much more than just making sure we stay safe here in our own territory. So that's a distinction I wanted to make up front. Final sort of warm-up point, and then I'll get into my main arguments or observations, would be that I'm not that obsessed with formal documents in this book. I'm not all that interested in exactly what the Quadrennial Defense Review of 1997 said. I certainly know those reviews. My career has been, you know, during the post-Cold War era when we've been writing these kinds of documents all the time, and they certainly find their way into my pages, but I'm more interested in our behavior than in our doctrine. And especially because trying to do a 250-year history, there weren't that many documents early on that, you know, people wrote the way White Houses and Pentagons write them now. And people were also not necessarily consciously pursuing a grand strategy of expansionism, or at least we didn't want to admit it. And we tried to find more polite language or more glorious language like manifest destiny, but we didn't have national security strategies under the Jefferson administration saying, I want to get the Louisiana territory from France, or, you know, in the Polk administration saying, I want to go to war with Mexico under the pretext of settling a border dispute in order to grab most of the West. So we didn't have documents that said those things, even though you could figure out by reading our history, that's what we were up to. And so again, I'm more interested in our behavior than I am in our doctrine. Although in the last 80 to 100 years, the doctrine does sometimes help you understand the behavior and sometimes not. So these are my main points. What I did in the book while doing this chronological survey of our defense strategies through the years in war and peace was to then conclude by bringing them all together and looking at how many I thought we had, where there was an explicit concept or change in direction that you could associate with that period. Obviously, this is somewhat subjective. Not everybody's going to agree with me that we had 17 major peacetime defense strategies so far in US history, or 26 specific identifiable wartime defense strategies. Those are my efforts to make sense of the chronology and then try to draw some lessons. It's a hard thing for me to imagine doing regressions against, or, you know, getting the coding in a way that people would find convincing. I acknowledge this is not quite rigorous political science in the way I've tried to do the history, but I did try to settle in on defining and, you know, aggregating some big observations and making some conclusions as a result. So what I want to do really now in the talk is just two main things with all that warm up under our belt. First, I'd like to go through a little bit of the first 150 to 75 years and just tell you a couple little stories or anecdotes about things that I found interesting as I did the book that I didn't necessarily know that well before. So I'm hoping some of you might not have known them all, or at least not thought about them as much as, so I'm not going to get into detailed strategies of Grant in the Civil War or things like that, but I want to walk through the decades pretty quickly and identify some interesting defense concepts, defense strategies, military operations that I think are suggestive of a larger strategic character of the United States and what it's been and what it is likely to be. And then I'd like to offer my observations. And by the way, my bottom line is not just that we've been very assertive, but that we don't understand that about ourselves well enough. And we think we are a people who are reluctant to use force and reluctant to get involved in the world. And we're not. That's just the biggest bunch of hooey I think I've ever heard. And I've been hearing it most of my life, whether I was in grade school being taught we're a peaceful people or any other point. I'm not saying we're a bad people, but I'm saying we're very assertive. And in a way, I sort of, Barry and others, I'm sort of in a way speaking, I think, to the restraint debate to some extent. Not that I'm necessarily a restrainer, quote unquote, myself, but I do think Americans are insufficiently appreciative of just how damn assertive we are. Can get us into trouble if we're not careful. For example, I remember back to Jim Steinberg, now the Dean at SAIS, former Deputy Secretary of State, when he was coming out of the foggy bottom under Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, he encouraged me to write this book on China that he and I wound up doing together. And he said, you know, here's the problem, Mike. China is feeling its oats. And they have a great sense of themselves as a great people and country, and they've been through a century of humiliation, and they're not going to do that again. And we are about the most cocksure, confident people on earth. I'm not quoting him precisely, but he said these two countries with extremely strong sense of identity and purpose and confidence, and also a sense that what they do is right, and not just right for them, but right in some bigger, deeper sense. They could make trouble when they interact with each other. And, you know, they'll both potentially be looking to blow up small issues into bigger ones because they think these are sort of indicative of where we're headed. And if we don't get ahead of the game early on facing down China on issue X, Y, or Z, for example, we might therefore be encouraging more aggressive behavior. And so we're going to be prone to overreact. And China's going to be prone to overreact, and they want to make up for lost time. And so this was emblematic of the kind of thinking that I've sort of observed through our history. And I think Jim was right. And I think get us into trouble if we're not careful. If we don't remember just how prone we are to activism, if you will. Okay, thanks for letting me explain all of that. Let me start very briefly with the 1790s. I'm going to go fast, and I'm just going to tell some stories and make some mentions of a few defense strategies along the way and see if this contributes to a broader story. But I used to think of the 1790s as a sort of sleepy time when the main thing that was going on is Hamilton was setting up the the Treasury and deciding we should have a unified currency and assume all the individual colonies' debts at the federal level. But it turns out there was, as some of you I'm sure know, a lot going on in defense in the 1990s, especially as we got to about 1794. And we decided that we wanted to build some frigates. We had sort of dismantled our Revolutionary War Navy, such as it was. But by 1794, we decided to build 6 because we wanted to go pick a fight with the Barbary pirates over in the Mediterranean Sea because they were interfering with our commerce. And so we wound up negotiating a little bit of a temporary pact with them that made that less necessary. But then, as I'm sure you know, or at least some of you, I didn't know it very well before the book, by about 1797, 1798, Washington leaves the presidency. In 1797, John Adams becomes president. And now, because we are intent on trading anybody we want to trade with, the French get mad at us because they're at war with Britain again. Their revolution's gone in a certain direction. And so now the country that just helped us defeat Britain only 15 years before, France, is no longer a country we feel very grateful towards because they are now encouraging privateers and pirates to attack our shipping in the Caribbean and in the Atlantic because they see that as helping the enemy, helping Britain in an economic sense. And so we go into the half war or the quasi war with France. And again, that's just a historical fact. We didn't really wind up fighting them in any major way. But the reason we didn't fight them is really interesting, or at least a big part of the story that I hadn't known before. John Adams was president. Thomas Jefferson was vice president. They did not like each other at that point in their lives very well at all. They later became big pen pals, and they both died on the same day, July 4th, 1826. But at that point, they were rivals. They were not of the same political party, and they didn't really get along. However, they both knew one thing that they agreed on. They hated Hamilton. And I always thought Hamilton, tragic figure, killed in a duel, gave us this federal system of finance. What a good guy. But Adams and Jefferson both thought he was the most vainglorious guy. And one thing they didn't want to do was elevate him in power any further. And there was an idea percolating while we were in this quasi-war with France, short-lived as it turned out to be, that we should build a 10,000 soldier federal army, which we didn't really have at that point. We had a couple thousand stragglers here in one fort or another, but mostly just some small state militias. And Washington had warned against standing militaries and so on. But there was a proposal that a lot of people liked to build this 10,000 strong federal army and have Washington come out of retirement. Poor guy can't get a break. He thought he was finally at Mount Vernon for his retirement, which it turns out he only had 2.5 years left to live. But they want to make him the commander in chief of this big reinvigorated federal army. And then they want to have Hamilton as the chief of staff, which meant essentially the field general, because Washington wasn't going to leave Mount Vernon. So this would have been an army that was built for Hamilton to command. And Adams and Jefferson couldn't quite kill this idea, and they hated it. And they knew one thing: we cannot let Hamilton have that kind of an army, because he'll use it. And he'll decide, we didn't have civil military relations very well established in this country yet, and, civilian control of the military. And Hamilton would not have been one to necessarily do what his commander-in-chief instructed. And they were worried maybe he'd go suppress local revolts, like your whiskey rebellions here and there, or Shays Rebellion, anything like that. He might get on top of a little too early and aggressively. He might just go take Florida from Spain. Who knows? He might try again to take Canada, which, as many of you know, we've done several times in our history, try to take Canada. And it's fun to read Canadian government websites on this topic because they don't forget, even though we usually do. But Adams negotiated peace with France partly to stall and stymie this idea of developing a federal army. And they killed it, and we didn't build it. And therefore, we didn't give field command to Hamilton. So that was an example of a very rough and tumble debate. Politics were certainly not stopping at the water's edge, but also, even though we didn't yet build a federal army of any consequence, there were already rumblings afoot that maybe we should. And meanwhile, Adams and Jefferson, and then Jefferson when he's president, and the next few presidents, they all did have enough military force at their beck and call to pursue what was the key agenda of the day, which was expansionism to the West. And the interesting thing is, some of you may know differently, I see no evidence that anybody of consequence objected to westward expansionism. It was just in the American polity from the start. And the only question was, how fair do you try to be to the Native Americans as you push them out of the way? And do you sometimes try to honor your word with whatever peace deal you might have constructed locally with one tribe or another? But there wasn't really any doubt about the idea that this land was ripe for the taking. And we had an idea of a new form of government that should be spread widely. We were actually doing mankind a favor. And, there's something to the argument, right? But still, it was a way to deal with the moral quandary of how are you continually pushing people off their own land and then making deals with them that you break 1 or 2 or 5 or 10 years later, which was basically the story of the American westward expansion for the entire 19th century. So our military power in that era, again, we didn't have doctrines or strategies that said as much, but our military approach was to use state militias and some degree of federal backup when necessary to just keep pushing west and always make sure we had enough power to get the next push done without any big, national defense strategy or quadrennial defense review to to calculate just how many divisions we needed. It was more improvisation, but it was always, again, typically small numbers of Native Americans. And so we could sort of improvise and build up incrementally as we needed to. And it typically worked for us very well. So it was a brutally efficient military strategy in service of an undeclared and unacknowledged grand strategy of expansionism. And it characterized most of the 19th century, except, of course, during times of bigger wars. A couple more words on a couple of the other periods, and then I'll get to the main 5 or 6 conclusions. Interesting that, okay, we did keep building these frigates. We slowed down the pace, but we ultimately acquired a little bit of a navy. And then we fought Britain. And the War of 1812 is fascinating. I mean, most people probably at MIT even, or Brookings, can't explain exactly what that war was about even now. And we sort of know some of the proximate causes, like impressment of American sailors by British, and taxes and levies and bitterness still from the Revolution. But the interesting thing is we really didn't need to fight that war, because even though we didn't find out about this news till a little too late, the British government that was being toughest on us was replaced in London by a more favorable pro-American, or at least, anti-war kind of new government that didn't really want to force the issue on impressment or on tariffs. And yet we voted to declare war on Britain. And it was a close vote. New England was smart enough not to want it. The Whigs didn't want it because they did a lot of business with Britain. But so it was one of the only votes in our history. It was the only vote really on a declaration of war that was close. But nonetheless, we had that war. 3 years later, we didn't really have much to show for it, except a couple of great tales of naval success in the Great Lakes and elsewhere, and Andrew Jackson with the Battle of New Orleans. So we had some heroics to go along with this war, but the Treaty of Ghent that ended it really left things as they had been in policy terms and territorial terms. So it was sort of a war for no purpose and no outcome, no discernible net outcome. And the amazing thing is that we decided to have this war anyway against the world's #1 power without any preparation. And when there was a perfectly viable diplomatic way out, that we just chose to lose patience over. And once we got the word a few weeks later, because there weren't any transoceanic telegraphs yet, but once we got the word that the British government had changed its tune, by that point we were in too much of a huff to want to back down. So we went out and had a 3-year war anyway. I'm being a little bit flip with my choice of words to make a point. I'm not blaming us per se, but it's still sort of striking that this little tiny United States wanted to go fight Britain when there was a perfectly viable diplomatic way out, and when we didn't have any military preparation worth the name that was really going to help us prevail. We still managed to fight them to a stalemate, and at least we didn't lose ground. At least we didn't lose our independence, which some people in Britain were hoping for at that point. But fascinating window into the American strategic character and our proclivity to be assertive. Again, right after that war ends, now we've got a little bit of a navy. And so we send this guy named Decatur over to the Mediterranean again to deal with the Barbary pirates, who have gotten uppity one more time and have started to plunder American shipping. And they've broken the previous agreements we had with them. And so this guy, Decatur, now with a little bit of a real navy, at his beck and call, and others went over and basically conquered or defeated the pirates well enough to force them to a peace deal that they later respected for this time around, that basically said they'll stop plundering and stop taking hostages. And we didn't have to pay any further indemnities. Decatur becomes this big hero. He gets an honorarium from Congress, comes back home. He's about 35, 36 years old, big socialite, buys this big, beautiful house that's right across from the White House still to this day. But then he gets himself talked into a duel and gets shot and killed in 1820 at the age of 41. But again, I found him to be a personification of the American attitude of the day. It was very assertive and very confident. So let me fast forward to the US-Mexico War. And a couple of things about this conflict that I found fascinating. Obviously, we are still pushing westward between the War of 1812 and the US-Mexico War of 1846 to 1848. But, that's sort of time tested. We've been doing this for a while. We knew how to do that. So the big new question now in 45, 46 is with Texas wanting to join the United States after a decade of independence and after having, before that, broken away from Mexico. We now decide that with Mexico part of the country, that we're going to force a border dispute with the Mexicans over the southern border of Mexico, or of Texas. But that was really just an excuse because, as you know, by the end of this thing, Winfield Scott, who had been the top general in DC, but asked the president if he could then be in field command, wound up organizing a 10,000 strong flotilla sailing out of New Orleans in 1847 to then go down to Veracruz, Mexico, lay siege to that town, take control of it, bring the 10,000 troops ashore, march inland for 200 miles up steep mountainous terrain towards Mexico City with the intention of taking Mexico City and then forcing the Mexicans to give us all of what's now Western United States if they wanted us to leave and leave them alone and leave them with the rest of their country. And we did all that. And there were some pretty amazing engineering feats. The United States is starting to become a serious economic and industrial power by this point. We've got railroads that help us bring people to New Orleans. We've got this big shipping capability that allows us to then do a major amphibious operation. I mean, there's no hostile fire, but still moving 10,000 people a few hundred miles is moderately impressive, and having them with enough logistics and sustainment, they could then spend the whole summer in Mexico on the way to Mexico City. And a lot of future Civil War heroes like Robert E. Lee, or hero, I guess is a debatable term, but future Civil War participants were involved in this conflict. And Lee was one of the engineers who helped us figure out how to come up a mountainous trail that the Mexicans were sure we couldn't find a way through. And therefore we were able to come behind and ambush them. It was a big part of the successful march on Mexico City. But again, a striking example of American temerity and self-righteousness, that this was our land. And you could see the case, right? Because, I mean, if this is the United States of the day, and Mexico's people are mostly down here, and Mexico's only been independent for 25 years from Spain, and this whole territory used to be a Spanish territory, and there are very few Mexicans up there anyway. Why would we think it was proper for Mexico to keep that land? I don't make this argument too often to my Mexican research assistant because I do want her to keep working for me and be nice and stuff. But we demanded all this and we got it. And so again, it's striking how not only how ambitious we were in sort of grand strategic terms, but how efficient we were in military terms. Now, meanwhile, the Navy's starting to get a little restless, though, because they're becoming a support service through all of this. And that continued to a large extent, I would say, in the Civil War, where, as you may recall, I'm not going to get into the details of the Civil War, and I will wrap up this historical sweep in just a second. But you may recall that in the spring of 1862, McClellan, his big move for that year was to put a lot of forces on ships and then come down to an area just east of Richmond and disembark, and then try to move westward to both take on Lee's army and hopefully seize the capital of the Confederacy. And he failed. And of course, that was the beginning of the end for McClellan in many ways. But that was also a huge, big amphibious operation that also went very well. But it was also clearly a support mission. It was a logistics operation. But still, we're starting to show our mettle. And the Navy's also building up a little bit of desire to return to the glory days of winning some battles against the British in the War of 1812. And you start to see that now, and I know we have friends from the Naval War College and elsewhere, you start to see this big push for a modern Navy that, as many of you know well, being New Englanders and security studies experts, really picked up steam in the 1870s and 1880s. And a lot of things happened all through that period of time. We started to build more advanced technologically, more technologically advanced ships, and starting to have much better engines and Ironsides and what have you. Also, we're starting to compare ourselves to European navies. We still are not really comparing ourselves to European armies in force planning. We don't really care that they all have hundreds of thousands of troops and we only have a few tens of thousands. But we're starting to get a little bit of a rivalrous attitude towards the Navy. And we wind up by 1880 becoming fourth in the world in naval tonnage. We get up to third in the world in the early 1900s. But of course, this is a process that's reinvigorated by a few key milestones like the creation of the U.S. Naval Institute in the early 1870s, the Naval War College in the 1880s, Alfred Thayer Mahan and his writings on the importance of navies for countries and their security. Mahan was a little bit of a romanticist. He was really writing about the century before, more than the century of today at that point. But nonetheless, his book caught on. And I don't know if this is anecdote and Mike, you can correct me, but some people say it was arguably the best-selling or one of the most important nonfiction books of the 19th century in the United States and most influential. And he was pushing on an open door because you already had the Theodore Roosevelts and the Benjamin Harrisons and the McKinleys in positions of political power who wanted to build a Navy themselves. So you start to see a steady progression of authorizations of 3 and 4 and 6 battleships through the presidencies of Harrison, McKinley, Roosevelt, Taft, and even Woodrow Wilson. So I know I've gone on a fair amount already. Let me start to now just do a touch on the 20th century and wrap, and then get to my overall observations. Woodrow Wilson, of course, very complicated person. At Princeton, we no longer are supposed to say his name. In Washington, I guess we still can, because there's still a Woodrow Wilson Center for Scholars, because his racism was focused more on domestic issues than foreign affairs. But everybody, my colleague Bob Kagan, who just did a long history of the U.S. from 1900 to 1940 or so, he just tells me about how nobody liked Wilson. But Wilson was a pretty good politician in the sense that in 1916, he both promised to stay out of war and got ready for war all at the same time, and also fought a war because we invaded Mexico again in 1916. And so there was all this churn. Wilson's up for re-election. He promises the voting electorate that he's not going to go to war, that this is going to be a way to, voting for him is a way to keep the warmongers out of the White House. And we hadn't yet had the Zimmerman telegram or the resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare in the Atlantic, which were the two things that really pushed Wilson to war in 1917. But still, in 1916, we did have the big Navy Act, which authorized, again, another big increment of battleship construction. Now, it turned out, by the time we got into World War I, we had to change that construction to what we might call today frigates, smaller ships that were more for anti-submarine warfare and convoy protection, because that's what we needed really in 1917 and 18. The Navy's role in World War I was to get people across the Atlantic fundamentally. But in 1916, there was still this Mahanian vision that what you need is battleships. That's what really proves your manhood. That's the metric of international power. And even though we were, from the White House, promising to stay out of World War I, we were sort of half getting ready for it, but really just trying to get ready to be a great power, whatever that meant going forward. And so the period from I would say roughly 1880, and again, Michael and others, you may want to correct me here in the discussion, but through the midpoint of World War I is a period when we're really starting to see the American interest in global power projection develop. And of course, we had acquired Hawaii along the way. We had acquired the Philippines for a while along the way. And so our little, run of imperialism was in this period as well. And so again, I used to sort of vaguely think of the early 20th century as a period of isolationism. It really wasn't. I think if you're going to use the word isolationism, the only time I would say you could really use that word convincingly from my perspective is the 1920s and 30s with the Washington Naval Treaty, the defeat of the League of Nations and the Versailles Treaty with it. And then, of course, the Neutrality Act of 1935 and 7 that said we were going to stay out of war no matter what. I think those periods of time, we were quasi-isolationist, at least in regard to Europe and Asia, not so much our own Western hemisphere. But even in those periods of time, you saw a lot of churn at the level of defense strategy. Our friends at Newport know all the wargaming that was going on there and the development of concepts for the proper employment of aircraft carriers, as well as amphibious assault armadas. But what I also found interesting in this period was that the Army, even though in some ways it was caught up in the dinosauric past, I think Patton still wanted to keep bayonet training going in the 1930s. And there were some top generals that wanted to keep every horse and said, I will fall on my sword over not taking a single horse out of the Army in the 1930s. But even though the Army was still sort of backward in those concepts and did not anticipate blitzkrieg as well as some European militaries, and obviously Barry's written on this issue as well, nonetheless, the Army was starting to do a few things right. It built an industrial college, and people like Eisenhower started to think about logistics and mass mobilization. And it was elevating the role of air power within the Army, with several big key moves in those early decades of the 20th century. So my argument here is that we weren't interested in being involved in Eurasia in the 1920s and 30s, but the military services and military strategy were still very ambitious, very curious, very entrepreneurial. And luckily, we're way ahead of the game in terms of preparation for World War II. They didn't think of it in those terms yet, and their political leadership would not have countenanced that. But the ideas that we used in World War II, many of them at least, were being developed in this period of time. And if defense strategists had been asleep at the switch as badly as political leadership and grand strategists, we would have been in real trouble when World War II began for us. But we had a remarkably rapid, in my mind, rapid adoption of the right concepts for warfare, not in every case, not uniformly, but the idea that we were already probably seeing how we would win World War II by late 1942, early 1943 is pretty impressive, given how much of a head start the Germans and the Soviets had against us and how little preparation we had done in broader terms. So that's my quick run through history. And now let me just tick off, you've got these on the handout that some of you may have found, just 6 or 7 observations. And because I've already taken more than a half hour, I think I'll be parsimonious and concise with this part and look forward to the discussion, which will be more fun. So I've already spent the last half hour trying to make my central point, which is we are a very assertive country. And you sometimes see this even more clearly if you look at military strategy and operations than if you just stay at the grand idea level of grand strategy. And even in the periods when our grand strategy seemed relatively restrained, there was always churn beneath the surface at the level of military preparation. That's my probably central point. And we've had very few periods of true peace. Basically, in the 19th century, we were never at peace. We were always fighting somebody, usually Native Americans. But sometimes the Brits, late 18th century, almost the French, our erstwhile allies, the Spanish, the Mexicans. So we were constantly spoiling for the next big adventure. We didn't usually think of ourselves as a militaristic people. We didn't relish war for its own sake, but we were sort of, just burgeoning. We were just popping our shirt sleeves. We just wanted to grow. We had this sense of manifest destiny, and we justified it in ways that very few Americans seemed to disagree with. Sure, there were disagreements over tactics, over the next step, et cetera, but the big idea of expansionism was remarkably widely held. My third overall point, and I haven't really explored this yet, but let me take a couple more minutes on this. When I look across our history and I look at our key defense strategies or military strategies in wartime, I think we're a country that's had a relatively successful military record to date, but not anything close to stellar. And just to put it in slightly political sciencey terms, when I do look through my 25 or 26 discernible military strategies in our history over 8 major wars and some smaller ones as well, I conclude that more than a third of our strategies failed, either completely or partially. And I'm thinking about, just to give you an example, Washington's attempt at defending New York in 1776, or the original Union strategies in the Civil War, whether you want to call them just one strategy with McClellan and Hooker and Burnside, or have a separate one for each of the three, that overall approach. Certainly, another interesting point is that in the modern era, when we've had, by most measures, or at least most estimations, most people's view, the best military in history, we've had our worst battlefield record. And I'm not the first one to make this observation, but it is sort of striking that in our 5 big wars since 1945, I would say our record is 2-2-1, or maybe, I'm sorry, I should have said 0-2-2, if you want to put the Iraq War all together in one package, or maybe if you want to break it out separately, you could call it a tie for where we are so far, or a stalemate. But we lost in Vietnam, we lost in Afghanistan in military terms. You could say in grand strategic terms, we wound up doing okay because we showed our mettle to defeat communist expansionism in Vietnam, and we showed our mettle to defeat global jihadism in Afghanistan. And at a grand strategic level, those were more important than winning the fights in Vietnam or Afghanistan. But in terms of military and defense strategies, I think we lost clearly in Vietnam and Afghanistan, more or less fought to a stalemate in Korea, and I would say so far in Iraq. So the strategies that we had in Korea, you know, especially MacArthur's sloppy movement north with very little tactical preparation for possible enemy counterattack, ignoring intelligence on Chinese presence. It may not have been MacArthur's fault that he went over the 38th parallel, because all of Washington agreed with him on that, or at least chose not to stop him. But he was the one who was responsible for this sort of cavalier race to the Yalu River, telling troops on Thanksgiving they'd be home by Christmas, and otherwise leaving us unprepared for what was coming next. So we've had a lot of defense strategies within wars that didn't play out so well. And we've had a number of, at least two big wars that we've lost. But my next point is, and you may want to challenge me on this or discuss this further, I would argue that our peacetime defense strategies have actually been more successful than our wartime defense strategies. Let me take a minute to say what I mean, and then I'll be just about done. What I mean by this is, first of all, a wartime defense strategy is sort of easier to evaluate, right? Because it has specific aims trying to defeat a specific enemy on a battlefield in a certain amount of time. Some wars are messier than others, but you can usually tell by agreed criteria if a wartime strategy fails or succeeds. Whereas how do you evaluate a peacetime defense strategy? A peacetime defense strategy has several purposes, right? Or should be evaluated. How well does it do at helping prevent the next war, if the next war is indeed preventable, which is never going to be knowable at the time per se. You're going to have to look backward to evaluate a peacetime strategy. And then how do you improve your prospects for winning that next war if it does happen? And then how do you handle smaller crises and problems along the way during the period of supposed peacetime? To me, those are the three main metrics that I would use to try to evaluate a peacetime defense strategy. And I would argue that in our history, we've really never had an abject outright failure with a peacetime defense strategy, that we've typically achieved at least some or most of our goals measured against those three metrics. And I'm happy to get into specifics if you like. The specifics are on the sheets that were handed out if you want to look up, but I won't take your time on that right now. Last 2 points. Sometimes our defense strategies, as I say, have been more effective, better thought through, and more helpful to the nation's future than the grand strategies of the day. And that's especially true, I think, in the 1920s and 1930s, but there are probably other periods in our history where that's true as well. But in the Cold War, and maybe in the post-Cold War era, I would argue that our grand strategy has sometimes been better than our defense strategies. In other words, the idea of containment, of engagement, of internationalism, of alliance, cohesion, and formation, these ideas, even though there's challenge within certain schools of thought, obviously, about this, these ideas have, generally speaking, done pretty well at preserving great power peace. But a lot of our military strategies on specific battlefields have not done so well. So in the 1920s and 30s, defense strategy, as I'm defining it and arguing it, was better than grand strategy. But since 1949, 1950, quite often, even when the grand strategy seemed coherent and generally correct, or at least in my mind, the military strategies that we've applied in certain places to try to uphold and serve that grand strategy have often not done so well. So thank you for your patience as I do this fire hydrant race through American history and throw out a few observations. I really look forward to your reactions. And again, thanks for having me up to MIT.
Great, thanks, Mike. So let's see. Please raise your hand. I see Ben Harris. So Ben, you're on deck. Everyone else, raise your hand above your head too, so I can actually see you in the back. Okay.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I'm Ben. I'm a PhD candidate here. Like all of us, really interested in American history and sometimes our American military history, and sometimes don't appreciate how far back it goes. In terms of your presentation, much of U.S. military history consists of unprovoked aggression against our neighbors, territorial annexation, and genocide against Native Americans. Today, it's been a long time since we've been at war with Canada or Mexico, but obviously sabers are being rattled by the current administration. In your review of American military history, do Do you have an answer for why did we reach a peaceful period with our neighbors? Like, why did we stop continuously going through territorial wars with Mexico or potential invasions of Canada? Do you think that this was a result of normative shifts in American behavior, or was this simply a matter of like the U.S. had taken everything we had wished to take? And given that answer, why do you think that it might be changing now? And should we be worried about going back to an aggressive relationship with neighbors?
Shall I just respond directly?
Yeah.
I'm sure everybody in this room would have a thoughtful answer to that, and I'm not sure I'm any better qualified than anybody else, but let me just offer my quick thoughts. I do think we got most of what we wanted. There's sort of a natural feel for going from the Atlantic to the Pacific, more or less on the north-south demarcation of the original colonies. Then you might as well take Florida while you're at it, because it seems unnatural to let it be in Spain's hands. I mean, when you put yourself back in 19th century terms and mentalities and think about what they were trying to do, the idea of a westward expansion made natural sense. Now, sure, people got greedy at times, and we went up into Canada in 1775, and then we thought about it again in the War of 1812, and we thought about it again mid-century in the 19th century out west. But there was sort of a natural progression. And then as we conquered most of what we thought we wanted, we then were entering the industrial age in the United States. And so our desire, for our alpha male desire for greatness seemed to be channeled more into economic industrialization, sometimes punctuated by involvement in world wars, but especially for, the early parts of that period, we were content to be the sheriff in the Caribbean and Central America with the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, but we didn't really evince any great interest in having most of that territory, at least that I've encountered in my readings of US history. So I do think there was a natural sense of completion of the task, and then a redirection of the pursuit of national greatness more towards industrialization. And then, of course, the world wars kept changing our calculus a little bit as time went on and brought us to a whole new era, which then leads naturally to your second question as to whether that was a permanent change or whether someone like Donald Trump or his successors could bring us back more to the 19th century. I mean, Trump is not that unusual of a president if you count the 19th century. He's not that unusual of an American president if you think in those terms. And, and of course, I guess he prefers McKinley, who was the last president of the 19th century and the first of the 20th. But it raises all sorts of questions that we debate, obviously, in IR theory and everywhere else as to whether human nature ever really changes, whether international relations ever really change, and whether an anarchic international order or international system is a fundamental reality, or whether that can be modified with time through new institutions and liberalism. And the debate as well as I do, probably better. So I tend to, I'm just going to say, to me, Trump feels unusual, except he's now been elected twice with a 4-year breathing and cooling off period in between. So maybe it's not gone for good. And maybe we're going to have these debates 19th century style yet again. I don't think there are that many Americans who want to behave the way Putin and Russia are behaving now, but Trump seems to be one of them, and we'll see if he's willing to really use military force. I mean, that's one more thing. I'm sorry to meander, but Trump's a fascinating person. He's so belligerent as a personality, but he doesn't seem to like military applications of force. And I guess we'll find out if that's really true as we see how these issues that you've raised play out.
Charlie Glazer.
So some people have made the argument that the expansion was really, you made it sound very much like it was ambition and self-image and so forth. They made the argument that controlling most of the continent was necessary for security. It's a really sort of security expansion, taking up space so that other major powers couldn't take it eventually and so forth. So having looked at it, quite carefully, do you see any of that, or is that just people reading their theory into the history?
I think it's more the latter, but I acknowledge that, you could have made a pretty good presentation in 1820 or 40 or 60 and say, if we don't keep moving west, somebody else sometime will. And it's pretty hard with all of our current understanding of international relations to completely dismiss that argument. And so I acknowledge that there's a logic to it. I don't think I came across it very often in reading about what motivated us in the 19th century. I think what motivated us was ambition. And so I don't think, my own view is that the offensive realism school of thought can't really explain American behavior satisfactorily for me, because at least in terms of what was motivating us, we wanted not just security, we wanted power and influence and greatness. And so that you know, I'm sure everybody in the room's read a lot of 19th century history, has their own take on it, but I don't see too many people sort of taking a defensive crouch in these debates and saying, well, if we don't take that land, somebody else from Europe or Asia is going to get there someday. It's more just, it's there, we want it.
And there were, in some cases, not a lot of constraints.
Right.
I mean, it wasn't like you had to consider paying a very high price.
Right.
Which maybe different. Let's see. Eli, was that a one finger or a two finger? One. Okay, good. Let's see. Eric Higginbotham.
Yeah, thanks, Mike.
Eric.
Very interesting. I wanted to get at your third and fourth bullet points here, the record of U.S. military strategies and then the replacement of leaders when things aren't working. I guess when I think about U.S. military history in particular, the first thing that I would do is, bin wars or conflicts according to, are they conventional military campaigns or are they counterinsurgencies? So one could make a case that we have an almost perfect record in, major conventional wars. They're either draws or wins, right? And we have an almost perfect record the other direction with counterinsurgencies. I suppose you could say, the wars against the Indians were successful, where it was a war of annihilation and replacement. But apart from that, we haven't succeeded. So I guess the two questions are, in looking at how these wars start and what the predictions are and what the military sort of advice is, does this come up? I mean, we went into wars in Iraq and Afghanistan with a highly imperfect record of counterinsurgency, right? Did it come up? Should it come up? And I guess we would agree with the generalization.
That's an interesting point. I think there's a lot to it. And I'll come back to Iraq and Afghanistan in a second, but let me start with the occupation of the Philippines, because you asked about the advice people were giving or getting at the time. And that was like the old case of the dog chasing the car and not knowing what to do when it actually caught up to it. Because all we knew, we wanted to defeat Spain in the Philippines. We didn't necessarily want the Philippines. Now, maybe once we had it, there were a few people who sort of liked the idea for a while, but we didn't get that enthusiastic about it as a nation, in my understanding of the history, and we didn't decide to replicate the effort, and we didn't keep our heart in it that long. We did do counterinsurgency in the Philippines for a while, and maybe not atrociously by comparison to certain other cases, but we didn't necessarily see that as the beginning of a big empire that motivated Americans. We still had a lot of ambition for controlling Central America and the Caribbean and making sure that we upheld the Monroe Doctrine and making sure we upheld the open door in China and those kind of things. But I didn't see a lust for doing more of this. And I didn't see a lot of people expecting it to look like what it did when it happened. So that may not really completely answer your question. And also that case is, I think, more of an intermediate between victory and defeat. So it complicates your framework a little bit. I still think there's a lot to your framework. We all know the history of, how the U.S. Army wanted to make sure it didn't have to fight Vietnams ever again. And in some cases took conscious measures to make it less likely. I don't really think that the total force concept, however, was so much that as a way to just save money, given the defense budgets of the day. There's some people who say the Abrams doctrine was, make sure you build a guard and reserve so that if you ever have to go to war again, you'll need the whole force, and therefore you'll have to reach into American communities from the start, and that will set a higher political bar towards interventionism, and therefore we won't have another Vietnam. Some people have made that argument about the Abrams doctrine, but I don't think that was the main driver for him at the time when he constructed this dependence on the reserve component. It was more to save money and have enough force structure to make sure we didn't lose in Europe or buy some time, in Europe. So in that sense, the Army, I think, really didn't want any more Vietnams. Who could blame them? And in some cases went out of their way not to train for those kinds of things, hoping that would make it less likely perhaps that we would do it. But I'm sure some people just thought we had learned our lesson. Of course, we're not going to do it again. Some people thought, let's not convey the expertise or competence in that because we don't want to be asked to do it again. And then certainly for the first 3-4 years in Iraq and Afghanistan, we did have to relearn a lot of what we had previously learned maybe in the Philippines or in the small wars of peace, as Max Boot describes them. So anyway, I've touched on a couple aspects of your question. I don't think I've done complete justice to any of them, but those are just some initial thoughts.
Caitlin Talmadge.
I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit more about where you see grand strategy and defense strategy going in the current administration, and if you could say anything specific, for instance, about components of defense strategy that we all tend to look at, things like the force sizing construct. Because to my mind, there's been a lot of continuity actually since 2018.
Yeah.
And I think you point that out in your handout. Kind of that's all sort of one defense strategy. Do you see movement away from that in important ways, continuity? And if you do see big movement away, how sticky do you think the changes will be?
Yeah, it's a great question, Caitlin. I love your take too, but I think that at some level, Trump hasn't decided yet, right? He doesn't buy into the sort of liberal internationalism, clearly, but he could be very comfortable in an IR theory debate in some ways, at an American university, because in some ways he's a traditional realist, right? And he wants to apply power for specific goals and not so much lofty goals or lofty constructs. And yet he hasn't actually pulled us out of any alliances yet. And when he made those decisions in late 2018 that led Mattis to resign, that he was going to pull out of Syria and then draw down by 50% in Afghanistan, he later even reversed those decisions. Mattis was gone and didn't come back, but we stayed in Syria and we drew down more slowly in Afghanistan than Trump had first threatened. So, it's a work in progress. I don't know how to read the guy. I think that part of why he got reelected is because people saw that his actual decision-making seems to be more cautious than his rhetoric. However, I would have challenged anybody voting for Trump to ask how they explain January 6th with that outlook, and also how they explain the demolition of the US government that's being attempted right now. So I think Trump is, capable of doing some very bold things. Just in his first term in foreign policy, he ultimately chose to back away. My own view is his instincts on Ukraine are largely correct. And I've never been a proponent of Ukraine and NATO, and never felt that we should just have an open spigot for the Ukrainians because they're on the side of right. I mean, yeah, at a moral level, they're on the side of right, but militarily, they don't have a chance. The Biden policy had run its course and needed to be replaced by something. And so we'll see if Trump's successful. But for him not to want to bring Ukraine into NATO, I don't see that as a repudiation of our existing international order or alliance networks. I just see it as a practical decision for that particular case. So this is a long way of saying I don't know. And so far, it's every single day is scary, but nothing truly catastrophic has happened yet from the point of view of international order, and nothing even revolutionary has happened yet from the point of view of international order. There are a lot of things that are specific that are important, but nothing systemic to my mind. But
So a two-finger from Pippin, which I was going to ask. I think I know what he's going to ask. So
Well, I mean, I think the rhetoric can be damaging, even if it isn't followed by action. One, already sort of the discussions about, differentiating within NATO who you're going to defend through Article 5 based on contributions. Two, giving up, the dual hat EUCOM SACEUR to a European. I mean, that would be at least 75 years of continuity being disrupted. The other area, and it's gonna be parochial, obviously, but for at least the last 75 years, there's nuclear strategy sort of overlaying broader defense strategy as well,
Yeah.
right? And one area of discontinuity, it seems to me, is if you retrench or the allies fear you are, unlike the last 75 years, you will have to be comfortable with allied proliferation. And the idea that, we opposed it because we didn't want France dragging us into a war that they started, but we have the real possibility. And I don't see how we could sit out a war in East Asia, a nuclear war in East Asia or in Europe, as much as we may try. So I wonder how you see that sort of discontinuity, even rhetorically, which can have the impact of sort of allies trying to get out of the war.
No, Pippin, I agree with everything you said, and it's part of why I gave so much money to Trump's opponents and prayed every night that he not be elected and live every day in fear. So, but but I would still say that so far, the international order at a broad global level hasn't really been changed. And if you have to, I mean, I like the, well, maybe not, but if you have to, I was just going to say, if you have to dive down to who's SACEUR to tell me that there's been a monumental change, I would say that proves your point that it hasn't yet happened, proves my point that it hasn't yet happened, because it's nice to have an American in charge, but an American's going to be in charge no matter what at some level, because we're going to have the biggest military if we get involved. And yeah, the question is, would we get involved under Trump? I would still say that as long as we have 20,000 American forces on NATO's eastern flank, his rhetoric only goes so far towards actually changing the order. Now, if we pull those 20,000 out and he keeps talking the way he does, and he gives SACEUR to Europe, and he talks more about not defending Europe in a crisis with Russia, maybe that adds up to enough of a threat that I would agree with you. We've had a
I think for those who know that if the only nuclear weapons under SACEUR's control, not STRATCOM's control, as you know, are the forward deployed B-61. So if the U.S. does not have SACEUR, then that, to me, portends that you're probably going to withdraw U.S. nuclear forces from here.
You might be right about that.
Right.
Yeah, I wouldn't.
It's the only way that works. Right.
So I want to go back to something Caitlin raised. I guess I don't quite understand, or can you help me better understand what you think the relation between grand strategy and military strategy is? Because, you know, the theme here, right, is assertiveness, right, in military strategy, but it often seems like the grand strategy is assertive, right? And so do you see it mostly integrated? Do you see periods of disintegration with sort of Barry's wheelhouse? But if we're, you know, so that's sort of part one. Part two, right? If you're thinking about Trump, right, the grand strategy may be one in which there is real impact on the military strategy, but because it's day 50, what are we in? 56, 58? I don't know. I mean, we just don't know yet, but things that are, you know, being put in place now, right? 3, 4, 5 years from now might suggest, you know, we're headed in a very different direction.
So, well aware that there are people in this room who written on this extensively. I would simply hazard grand strategy and military strategy don't have to be aligned. That would presumably be a policy mistake, but we make mistakes all the time. And so I think for me, the most interesting period to look at to try to parse this would be the Cold War, because people say we had such a clear grand strategy, containment. But George Kennan, who is the father of that concept, disagreed with almost everything we did in the next 10 years after he articulated that idea. And so to him, at least, the military strategy did not follow from his view of what the grand strategy was. But for many of the rest of the Americans of that day, they thought that if you're going to contain the Soviet Union, you do have to have military force in Germany, Germany rearmed, and an alliance structure to make that all happen. And then, of course, as you know, same kind of thing with Japan. And then ultimately we decided with Korea. Korea is another fascinating case, because probably if most of us who are professors had read Dean Acheson's speech from early 1950, when he said that Korea should not be in our defense perimeter, and we were asking him to submit that in a course on grand strategy, and we were going to grade the paper, a lot of us would have given him an A, because it sort of made sense not to worry about Korea, given our limited resources, our desire to keep recovering from World War II, and bigger fish to fry elsewhere, like in Europe and Japan. And yet he would have gotten an A, and yet now in history, everybody thinks that he made a big mistake, or not everybody, but most people, because it turns out, not Vipin, but he still could get an A with that paper in Vipin's course. But
Everyone gets an A in Vipin's course.
I'm sorry, I'm teasing, but
Not you. These guys call me out.
okay. But the fascinating thing is that the fact of the attack then became important unto itself in a way that psychologically and strategically we didn't even predict in our own behavior. Whether you think we were wrong to respond in Korea or not, I think it's pretty clear that the United States completely changed its mind as a country over about the course of a week. And it's fascinating. It should be humbling as to how well we're ever going to really know our minds, because that case in point, like Charles, I don't know how we would respond over a crisis over Taiwan. I don't think any of us really can know. And whatever Joe Biden says on one day and then retracts the next, and then whatever Donald Trump says. I mean, until that kind of a monumental thing happens, how can you really predict where the national psychology and the presidential psychology will be? So I think we have to acknowledge that, you know, there are cases, therefore, we're trying to translate a grand strategy into practical behavior, which is sort of what I'm thinking of with military strategy. Because again, I'm saying military strategy is more what you do than what you say you're going to do. And so it's your budgets, it's your forces, it's your deployments, and it's certainly your wartime operations. That to me is military strategy. And sometimes it will change, and therefore sometimes it will be out of sync with grand strategy, sometimes not.
Wright Smith.
So I wanted to talk about, so you said this comment earlier about the War of 1812, or politics very much does not stop at the water's edge. So to put my cards on the table, I think the idea that politics stops at the water's edge is a myth,
Right.
personally. And I'm curious what you saw in your research for this book. How much does domestic political contestation shape defense policy and war conduct?
Yeah, I agree. It's a myth. And when, you know, Vandenberg gave that speech, I think in January 1947, it might have been true for the next 12 months. And that was about it. And even there, it wasn't completely true. But, and of course, Truman ran for re-election or for a second term in 1948, calling the Congress that he had just worked with a do-nothing Congress, even though they had passed the Marshall Plan and supported appropriations for the Berlin airlift and all these other things. So even in that period of time, there wasn't that much politicking stopping at the water's edge. But I mean, there's two ways to look at that. I think one is, where are the politics healthy because they interject new ideas into a debate that may be stuck on bad ideas, or where a new issue has arisen that you need to debate to reach some kind of sense of purpose and national consensus. And then there are cases where you're just, you know, calling people names and trashing them, you know, in an ad hominem way in order just to achieve a partisan goal, that where you're using foreign policy sort of as a way to scare people and get them emotional because, you know, the stakes are so high that if you can portray someone as incompetent for handling the nation's security, even if it's completely ad hominem and completely, you know, fictional, you can maybe achieve some political partisan points. If I frame it that way, I don't see that many periods where our politics were completely destructive or you know, purely opportunistic. There were plenty of times where people were, you know, harsh and tough, and there were some periods of outright, you know, just inappropriate behavior like McCarthyism. But there haven't been, in my judgment, that many wartime strategies or peacetime strategies that were fundamentally determined based on somebody achieving a successful political cheap shot and then being able to run with that. So I guess another way of saying it is that I think a lot of our defense strategies historically have had some degree of bipartisan support, ultimately. And not always. You know, if McClellan had won the 1864 election, the Civil War would have ended with the South seceding. And there are other cases you could think of too. But for the most part, I think, you know, what's interesting about our political debates, we sometimes, because we're partisans to them or participants in them, or we're so close to them, we sometimes get caught up in what wind up being details. And American strategic character actually has a more enduring quality across time and across parties. And I guess that's what struck me the most. It doesn't mean that politics is unimportant or that sometimes it's not unfortunate in the way it affects these debates. But one thing I'm struck by is, if anything, sometimes Americans have too much consensus. And I want to give an acknowledgement to Cambridge writ large, and Barry specifically, and a few others in this room, who warned us against too much consensus about the Iraq War. And I should have listened more than I did. I was a skeptic about that war, but I was not an opponent. And my main scholarly contribution was to try to say, if we do it, it's going to be hard. And we better be ready for that. But I probably should have been with my former professors, many of whom were part of the crowd warning against too much consensus. And maybe we should have had more politics of the right kind as opposed to less. But American strategic character prevailed, and we wound up doing the more assertive thing by pretty strong bipartisan votes in both houses. So I guess that's what strikes me most, that we wind up often, whatever we call ourselves, ideologically or politically, we often wind up trending towards assertiveness regardless.
Hanoi.
So Mike, I appreciated your introduction with the, let's call it extensive praise for doing history, but this acknowledgement of the difficulty of doing contemporary history, which is what we're talking about for most of our discussion here. I'm mentioning this because as I look at your sheet, we have a lot of variation in defense strategy, but we also have a continuous, largely coherent grand strategy from the 1950s to what you're calling the present. And then when all those questions came up from Caitlin, from Vipin and others, you kept saying, so far or yet.
Mm-hmm.
The question, if we look at that old grand strategy, the one that we all grew up with, it was one of alliances, security guarantees, some variations on that, and integrated economic order in the West with a line between the blocks. And it changed a little bit with the end of the Cold War, but not that much. If we turn to the present, and by here I mean, the vast information that we have, not from Trump 1, but from Trump 2, the last month and a half to 2 months, there may be fundamental changes in the air on economic affairs on the grand strategy level. Okay, we see huge changes in economic affairs if he's half serious about what he's talking about in terms of tariffs, his punishment of allies, and a breakdown of the liberal economic order. We see, again, it's not the end of NATO, but big steps in that direction. Listening to Munich was really quite an adventure, and then listening to the European reactions and their sense of credibility or lack thereof, this is not minor. Are we returning, in terms of grand strategy, to a spheres of influence doctrine with the US dominating the Western Hemisphere with our good friends in Mexico and Canada loving it, and Panama, with China, East China Sea, Taiwan, and Russia, obviously, Ukraine, and the near foreign affairs? Are you going to write an ego book for what appears to be a possible shift in grand strategy in a direction that we really haven't seen before?
Yeah, it's a great question, really well articulated. And I have to begin with my same answer I gave before. I don't know. And maybe I'm going to try to punt this one over to Taylor in a second, because I think one of the places we'll start to really learn whether Trump would like a systemic change is when he starts really focusing on East Asia. And so far, he seems content to more or less let it be. Even in the first term, of course, he went after the South Koreans all the time. And I was worried about the US-ROK alliance, and the 2019 National Defense Authorization Act, in a bipartisan way, prevents Trump from cutting US forces in Korea. Whether that would have been seen as constitutional, I don't know. I think Trump, too, would test that and do it anyway and see if the courts allowed him to. But in any event, he doesn't seem to have really turned his attention to East Asia yet, except in economics, and where you're obviously far more knowledgeable than I. And I would acknowledge your point that, yes, in terms of the international order, he already does seem to be very much on the verge of having, embarked on fundamental structural change. But until I know what he feels about the US-Japan alliance, the US-Korea alliance, South China Sea islands, freedom of navigation, and Taiwan, I won't know. My buddy Bridge Colby, of course, wants him to care even more about Taiwan. And I don't think Bridge is going to carry the day exactly with that argument of strategy of denial. But there are elements of the Trump worldview that could say we just need to make Europeans handle Europe more because we have other priorities elsewhere. That's, the Undersecretary for Policy incoming's view. I don't know if that's an argument he's going to win with Trump. So in security terms, I still say it's just way too soon to know. And as much as I share the anxiety, I still think that the current behavior towards the Ukraine war is compatible with coming out of this with the similar kind of transatlantic security bargain than we've had. I'm not predicting that, but the fact that Trump doesn't want Ukraine in NATO, that's not to me an unforgivable sin. The fact that he wants the war to end quickly, even if Ukraine has to accept that Russia sits on 20% of its pre-war territory, it's not an unpardonable sin. It's just reality.
To be clear, the Biden administration didn't want Ukraine and NATO either, right? It
That's-
was
yeah.
a long pathway,
right. But
consensus-based, condition-based, right? Like that was not
Pressure
now.
for negotiations.
Yeah, I mean, it was also to give leverage, and we just gave all that up.
yeah,
So
The differences between Trump 2 and Biden and Trump 2 and Trump 1 are much, much greater, I think, than most of us in this room would have thought on Inauguration Day.
it's a fair point. Do you want me to just listen to whatever remaining questions there are and try to wrap together, or how do you want to do it?
A few more questions. So let's continue your graduate school experience and turn it over to Greg Posen.
Excellent.
Well, I'm not going to break the rule that Taylor tries to sustain, which is to not have 2 and 3-part questions. I, in fact, have 2 distinct questions for you. I'm only going to ask one. I didn't see the handout, but in listening to your wind-up, I thought I was going to hear the talk more focused on how the American military chooses to wage war when it wages war. And I was hoping for a kind of revisit to Russell Weigley's American Way. So as I think about it, and in terms of even the example you gave on the Mexican-American War, which I don't really know that much about, but I would say since America became a relatively rich and populous country, our theory of victory has been based on massive material superiority. And that theory of victory has basically worked for us whenever we fought conventional wars, and has basically failed for us when we fought unconventional wars. Even when we fought unconventional wars, we chose to try to make material superiority matter. And if most Americans knew what happened in Vietnam, I think they'd be flabbergasted at the way we tried to project our material superiority on that little piece of real estate. So I guess I'm going to ask you a kind of a different continuity and change question from the one you've been asked. What do you think happens when the American military can't be assured of material superiority by the GDP and population that's behind it? You know, how does it deal with China, right? In its guts, in other words, in terms of its basic DNA after all these years. How does it deal with China? And I'm not asking for China specifically, I'm asking for an answer in the context of whether you think the material superiority hypothesis is right and that you're coming up to an inflection point.
It's a great question, unsurprisingly. First, let me agree with your premise or your argument 3/4 of the way. I would still, and therefore disagree with Weigley and you, maybe 1/4. When I survey our military history, I see cases like the Kosovo War, the overthrow of Saddam, the overthrow of the Taliban, and the decimation of Al-Qaeda leadership, where material enormity were not the crucial ingredients, but technological excellence and training were at least as important. That's fair. But actually, it's
a different manifestation of material superiority. Right, technological superiority at that level is a manifestation of the same phenomenon, which is reaching into the American economy and extracting from it great resources in order to crush the adversary. It just so happens that at that moment in time, technology allows you to do that. But I think it's a distinction without a difference in terms of the question.
Maybe. I mean, I was about to acknowledge that I hadn't yet deflected your question because the fundamental challenge still remains. But I do think that the small 1/4 part where I have a different take may point the way towards an answer, which is I think there are ways that first of all, we're getting pretty good at losing. we lose a lot, and admittedly, losing to China is different than losing to the Viet Cong or the Taliban. But if Americans had some pride that said we always have to emerge with a ticker tape parade, it's a long time since we were doing that. And I don't know if that helps us or hurts us, but it is true that we don't win that much conclusively anymore, as you and I both know. And so what I'm hoping that then allows, I'm not predicting it, but I'm hoping, is that if we got into a crisis or even the beginning stages of a conflict with China, we would recognize the distinct possibility that we're not going to win the war if it goes to higher levels of escalation, and that both sides could effectively lose, and that the crucial element is finding a way to defuse the crisis or conflict as soon as possible, even more than winning per se. I don't know that our political system would have the capacity to do that, because I think they would have to, because your question is otherwise unanswerable. If you can't defeat China through mass or technology, then you can't defeat China. I mean, a war over Taiwan is not necessarily one that we can just muscle our way to victory in. And I don't think that was true even 10 years ago. If they try to invade, that's one thing. And you and I have talked about this before, and I've tried to write on this. And if China tries to invade Taiwan, I think that's a soluble military problem. If they try to use asymmetric and indirect and blockade means to squeeze it, I don't think that's a militarily soluble problem. So we're going to have to therefore get victory out of our heads. And again, I'm being slightly facetious, but partly sincere when I say, at least we've gotten used to not always winning. Because in this kind of a crisis, the objective is actually to prevent World War III, not to have any particular outcome vis-a-vis Taiwan. That's less concerning. And Charlie Glazer's book will get into this, I know, in short order. But that maybe is not a great question, Barry, but I don't see how we can find a way to be confident we would defeat China in many of the scenarios that I could imagine us fighting them in. And so the habit that Weigley wrote that book in 1973. So yeah, he was affected by Vietnam, but he was probably more affected by World War II. And I don't think American strategists therefore have to fall back on World War II as the paradigm, and as much as we used to. I don't think the American polity necessarily expects that as much as we used to. But
So I've got a few people on the list.
Good.
There's some late entrants. So I'm just going to ask everyone to ask their question. Everyone gets one succinct, one sentence question, no wind up or editorial comments. So Mike?
Just,
Mike.
is it a story about American exceptionalism? Do you think the ambition is kind of distinctive? I know it's not a comparative study. Or do you think other countries have similar abilities?
Lauren?
In today's political environment, I would ask you to reflect on what it means to call strategies that are expansionist, colonial, and sometimes genocidal as things like an alpha male desire for greatness, ambitious and reasonable. What does that mean for politics today?
Eli?
You said in the beginning that America or Americans, that we have these assertive tendencies can get us into trouble. I didn't quite follow what you meant by that. I think you started to touch on that, but I was wondering if you could.
Okay. Ron?
I'll pass.
Okay. Daniel?
Yeah, so I'm interested in this origins column on the table. So a lot of these people are like individuals, but sometimes it's departments. So I'm interested in, you can talk more about the origins of these strategies. Is it the dispositions of the leaders? Is it situational? How much does like the thought of the adversary matter? Because the story you're telling is that it's like this kind of the U.S. It's like assertive character. That we do see variation then like across leaders. So it's something that's innate. Trying to then place that as part of the conversation about how leaders matter and are in confidence.
That was almost two questions. So you don't have to answer either one. Maria?
So also looking at the handout for major U.S. defense strategies in wartime, I noticed that some of these strategies overlap temporally. I'm wondering how do we think about a unified U.S. defense strategy when there are two essence of strategy going on at the same time?
yeah, it's a great question. It's a problem for me.
So you can choose to answer some, all, or just one of what you said.
Well, I'll try to go really fast. There are a couple that are going to be harder for me, so I'll try to be succinct. But on Mike's question about American exceptionalism, I think there are degrees of this with other countries, but nobody's ever taken more land faster than we have in history, and then consolidated a country around it. So, and then also no one's come up with a constitution.
The Germans tried.
Sorry.
The Germans
Oh, right, yeah.
tried.
You're right. And also no one's built a country around, this kind of a lofty ideal quite as much as we have. So for those two reasons, and then our geography, and our protection from other big powers because of it, I would say that our attributes in this regard are at a different order of magnitude than most other countries. And then, yeah, thank you. I've struggled with the language in the book itself. I talk about, I don't want to call the defense strategies against Native Americans successful, even though they achieved what they were trying to achieve. So, because that would sound like I'm condoning it. So I spent a little bit of time explaining where I come down on that, which is it did happen. And now I'm trying to make sense of it and explain how it fits into a longer pattern and a longer story. But I'm not going to defend it. But I'm also not going to say that, not going to pretend it didn't happen. So, but thank you. I'll also interpret your question as a warning that I have to, whenever I talk about this subject, be super careful in my language. And if that's what you were intending to do, thank you. And even if you weren't, thank you. And then on Eli's question about does our assertiveness get us into trouble? That was sort of a paraphrase of The Princess Bride when I forget the scene. Well, anyway, well, but Inigo Montoya is about to get killed.
Yeah,
that's right. Right.
Seen The Princess Bride? Raise your hand.
Oh, see, we learned something today. You might not have learned much about American history, but you learned something about contemporary culture. Okay, so what I mean is that we do tend to think most of our wars are noble, and I think actually most of them are, to an extent, most of the time, but not all of them have been, to your point. And we shouldn't assume that just because we have one view, that therefore it's the right view. And I would also submit something else that I've learned from my colleague Bob Kagan that this study has made me appreciate even more. We are not a status quo power. But people say it in Washington all the time, like it's obvious that we are. We are not. At this point, we may not be looking for territory, except Donald Trump might be, but we are looking to promote a certain vision of proper governance. And we think our version is right and other versions are wrong. So we are not a status quo power, and we got to get ourselves out of the habit of saying that, because it makes us feel like, anytime we wind up in a fight, it's because somebody else picked that fight. And sometimes they did, but sometimes, two visions of the world clashed, and we just need to think hard about the distinction. And then the question about who came up with different strategies, first of all, don't take me too literally or too scientifically. I didn't have a methodology for doing this that was applied, with an elaborate analytical process to each strategy. I did it more impressionistically. But I do think that, and by the way, anybody who wants to email me with critiques of anything I've said today or anything on these pieces of paper, please feel free. mohanlon@brookings.edu. And if you have a specific case or two where you think I got the origin wrong, I'd like to know. But I didn't have a methodology where I was saying, let's always make it an institution, or always make it a chief of staff, or always make it a secretary of war. To me, it was more just who I associated historically with the development and promotion of the idea. Otherwise I could be in trouble. Yeah. And then finally on how I have overlapping strategies sometimes. You're right. That's all I can do is try to, in the book, to explain why, because there are cases where the Korean War happened in the context of a broader military strategy of trying to uphold key alliances. And the Korean War, for example, or Vietnam War, was separate from the rest of defense strategy. The rest of defense strategy had to, uphold NATO and uphold U.S.-Japan, U.S.-Korea alliances and all the things that it was doing before, during, and after one of those wars. But we also had specific military goals for that conflict. So I want to break out the conflict, acknowledging that there's, zero-sum quality of using some of the forces in Korea or Vietnam that takes them away from other missions. But I really just wanted to be able to analytically look at wars that happened even during, I think, a broader period of a more general defense strategy. And so thank you. All I can say is I'm going to reread my book with your question in mind and see if I can be more clear in the book and maybe more clear in future talks. But I want to be able to do that. I want to be able to look at the Korean War, Vietnam War separately from what we were doing in Europe at the same time, and acknowledge that the two can't be completely separated, the actual war of the time versus the bigger global approach, but that analytically I want to be able to evaluate, MacArthur's various moves in Korea separately from what we're also doing with NATO at that same moment. So that's why, and I called the NATO stuff a peacetime strategy, the Korea stuff a wartime strategy, even though they're happening at the same time. So thanks for the question.
Great. Well, Mike, thanks so much for coming, and thanks for writing what sounds like it'll be a fascinating book for all of us to read. So please join me in thanking Mike.